Think of Brazil. Perhaps you hear the girl from Ipanema.
Olha que coisa mais linda, mais cheia de
Or see the balletic improvisation of soccer stars like Pelé or Garrincha. Perhaps you fantasize about an amorous encounter on Copacabana beach. Or long to save the Amazonian rainforest. I think that creating preconceptions and prejudices probably is part of the human condition. But there are few places in the world which are subject to such immutable prejudices as Brazil. I've been spending a lot of time there recently, traveling across the country, meeting its amazingly diverse people, whether ministers, whether workers, musicians, gang leaders. I've been visiting cities, farms which are the size of small European countries. I've been to prison there. I've even lived in a favela. What you have to remember is that Brazil is vast. Its cultures are immense. Its regions so different that you often feel you're traveling through about 9 or 10 different territories, none of them conforming to the stereotypes and the prejudices. At the delta of the Amazon, the people of Belém, a big trading post for jungle produce, have nothing or very little in common with the urban sophisticates of São Paulo in the south, the rumbling economic engine of Brazil. Life in Campo Grande, the capital of the farming province of Mato Grosso do Sul, conforms more to life in modern Texas than it does to the drama of Rio de Janeiro. So, if you look back in history, you begin to understand where these differences come from. Under the Portuguese, for example, a letter from Recife in the northeast, to go to Rio de Janeiro, it went 9,000 miles via Lisbon. It's only 1,000 miles from Recife to Rio de Janeiro, but over land it was impassable, and there was no commercial value in creating the sea route. And so the different parts of Brazil often didn't know each other very well at all. And this issue of fragmentation is one of 3 major influences which actually almost prevented Brazil from becoming a united state. Now, Brazil gains its independence from Portugal in 1822, and over 100 years later, you were still getting major armed separatist insurrections in the country. So, what was binding it together? Well, I can tell you what it wasn't. It wasn't football, and it wasn't samba, and it wasn't the sea. So let's first of all have a quick look at 1 or 2 of the divisions. Brazil is home to some of the richest people in the world and of course some of the poorest people as well. It's the 7th largest economy in the world, but it's also one of the most unequal. 1% of the population owns 13% of the wealth, which is the same as the bottom 50% of the population. Now, why did that come about? Well, like most things to do with Brazil, the roots lie in the peculiar nature of Portuguese colonialism. For 320 years after Portugal claimed a chunk of South America in the year 1500, the court in Lisbon treated this extraordinary basket of natural resources like a giant supermarket in which it could grab anything and then just bypass the checkout. What they would do is they would fill up their ships with gold and silver and sugar, and then they'd send it off to Lisbon from where it was distributed, and of course they would pocket the vast profits. But then they discovered that they were missing 2 things. They were missing muscle to work the plantations, and they were missing women to have children. And so they enslaved the local population, and the men were made to cut down the cane, and the women were forced to become maids, concubines, and wives. Now, unsurprisingly, the indigenous population weren't over-thrilled about being forced to work very hard or forced to sleep with the colonizers, and as the plantations grew, the slave population dried up because they either went to the jungles to protect themselves or they were wiped out by European disease. And so what did the Portuguese do to compensate? They turned east to Africa. Now, we all know about the impact of slavery in the Caribbean and in the United States. We know that because of the American Civil War, historical research, the Civil Rights Movement, and we know it because of literature, and above all, I think, because of film. But here's a really interesting fact. How many slaves were imported into the United States? About 450,000, give or take a few 10,000. How many into Brazil? 4.5 million. That is 10 times as many. But what do people outside Brazil know about the slave trade into Brazil? Let's be honest, we know very little about it. But in order to understand today's Brazilian reality, you have to get the shattering impact that slavery had on this country. And this is our second really important influence. Now, the European colonizers were as happy to sleep with the African slaves as they had been sleeping with the indigenous slaves. So you got more mixing of the population, but fraternization rarely extended to the economy. So the African Brazilians remain extremely poor and with very little access to the economic benefits of this country. And we see that after the 1930s, when industrialization happens in Brazil, the favelas start emerging. And who lives in the favelas? Well, it is mainly the descendants of African slaves. Now, when the Spaniards, their empire started breaking up at the beginning of the 19th century, most people assumed that the same thing would happen to Brazil. But it didn't happen to Brazil. So what was it that kept Brazil united, where the Spanish empire was breaking up into many, many different countries? What was it? Or more to the point, who was it? Enter Napoleon Bonaparte. In 1808, Bonaparte's Grande Armée is bearing down on Portugal, and the royal court and almost all of Portugal's aristocracy, about 10,000 people, take flight across the ocean, and they move the capital of the empire from Lisbon to Rio de Janeiro. It's a quite astonishing thing. There they are. This is a great comic book which tells the story of the flight to Rio, and there's the emperor at the time. And they stay there for about 10 or 11 years, after which Napoleon's defeated, and they go back. But they leave behind one very important character, Dom Pedro, the heir to the imperial throne. And in 1822, Dom Pedro announces the independence of Brazil from Lisbon. Now let's stop just for a second here and imagine this. So the Prince of Wales, later George IV, flees London to the 13 American colonies and then defiantly announces the independence of the United States from Britain. It's utterly preposterous, isn't it? But that's exactly what Dom Pedro did in 1822. And this lays the foundations which enable Brazil's various regions to stay together, because he used an anti-colonial rhetoric saying that together we can resist the bullying of Lisbon. And that is how Brazil essentially became united. Now, there have been other things which keeps Brazil going as an identity. One of the most important is the Portuguese language, which has evolved very differently than the language in Portugal itself, and there's a lot of differentiation in the country itself. But they love their adapted, adopted language. What it means is that they're separate from all the Spanish speakers around them. And the great thing for Brazilians is that most Brazilians can understand a bit or a lot of Spanish. And most Spanish can't understand a word of Portuguese. So that they feel gives them a great advantage. In the 1930s and the 1940s, there was a dictatorship in Brazil, the corporatist dictatorship of this man, President Getúlio Vargas. Now, Vargas knew that you can't have a dictatorship in Brazil based on race. And so instead, he created a unified, centralized Brazil. And in order to do that, he had to come up with some idea of what Brazil was. And his version of bread and circuses was feijoada and carnival. It's in this period that carnival takes on its modern form. People needed cheering up because all their civil rights had been taken away. But even more astonishing was the creation of the myth of feijoada. This is the national dish of Brazil. And it is a designer dish because it's culturally designed. The black beans represent the African population, the rice, Europeans, the manioc are the Japanese immigrants, of whom there are over 1 million in Sao Paulo. There's red chili sauce, which is the indigenous people, and then the side order of greens represents the great giver of life to Brazil and to the world, the Amazonian forest. And this was elevated by Vargas into a national dish to prove the unity and the racial harmony of Brazil. Now, Vargas himself was a nasty dictator, but he still has streets named after him. The biggest private university is named after Vargas, and that's because of his commitment to a Brazilian national identity. But for me, the really key thing in creating a Brazilian national identity took place after there was a coup, a military coup in 1964, which lasted for 21 years, supported at the time by both the Kennedy and Johnson administrations. America was ready to invade Brazil in support of the putsch, another dark spot in US foreign policy in South America. Now, the Brazilian generals weren't as brutal as their successors in Argentina and Chile 10 years or so later, but they were still a nasty bunch. But the Brazilian people resisted. And what's really impressive about Brazil and Brazilian identity is today's broad consensus that Brazilians want and will fight for their democracy, as they have done for the past 30 years, if not the past 50 years. And for that, I salute all of them. And this is a really important central issue for modern Brazilians. So the next time, or if you go for the first time to Brazil, try and forget for 5 minutes the samba, the sea, the football, and the caipirinhas. And just for a few minutes ponder on something which I think is more historically truthful, which is colonialism, slavery, the Portuguese language, democracy, and black bean stew. Muito obrigado.